Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Called. This is episode 5, and today I have an SM from Zimbabwe. Annaliese, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am Annaliese Grellmann. This is my second year taking classes at Walla Walla. Last year, I was a student missionary in Zimbabwe at a little children's home called Kudavana Partnership.
Awesome. And what made you choose Zimbabwe as your SM call?
I came into college knowing that I wanted to SM, and at the time, I was a nursing major, which meant that if I was going to SM, it had to be after my freshman year. So, literally, the second week of college, I was already starting the application process. So, I just got into college and I was already making plans to leave. And I went into it and I said, I'll go anywhere, I'll do anything. I'd love to teach, but I don't want to go to the islands. And so, I mean, I wasn't fully opposed to it, but I knew that there were other sorts of calls.
Right.
And I considered, actually, I was going to accept a position in Malawi. And so the day that I was going to go to the office, tell them, yeah, I want to go to Malawi, Brittany, who was the director at the time, she said, hey, I just heard about this new place in Zimbabwe. I think it would be a perfect fit for you. And I said, okay, I'll go there.
That's awesome. And what did since you started the process super early, I'm sure that was super convenient for you. How was that for you? Especially starting so early. I know a lot of people start pretty late, but was it pretty easy, pretty chill, or how would you say the process was for you signing up to go to anywhere?
I had a really positive experience. And I think one of the things that made me so confident going as an SM was my experience with the missions department.
Hmm.
All the staff were so friendly. I remember, because I went in the first time, I met a bunch of people, and like around campus weeks later, people would like greet me by name. And I'd be like, I can't believe that they remembered meeting me like 3 weeks ago. And I just had so many people that were willing to share their experience to help me with, the paperwork. And so, yeah, it was a really great process. And I started early, which of course was helpful.
Yeah, that's super awesome. So what exactly did you do in Zimbabwe?
My job there was very fluid. And we went in kind of knowing that. But the wonderful thing about Kudavana is that it is very self-sufficient and it is run by locals. That's a really great thing for the kids that they have that consistency, that they have someone from
Mhm.
their culture. So technically, Kudavana is an orphanage, but they call it a children's home because when we think of an orphanage, we think about like rows of bunk beds, like big cement room.
Right.
But at Kudavana, we are out about 45 minutes away from the nearest town, and we're on this compound, a little plot of land, and there's a circle of homes. And there's 5 group homes where the kids are raised with siblings. If they come with biological siblings, they'll all be together. But then girls, boys, you know, the littlest up to the age they go to boarding school. And then they have consistent local caregivers. And so the kids get to be raised in a family unit. And then there's also a nursery. And just because infants take a lot of work and time and attention, there's a nursery where the infants will stay until they're about 2 years old. Then they'll move into the home that they'll live in for the rest of their time there. And then there's also a school right on the campus that hires local teachers. So often SMs will go and they'll either teach or they'll be caregivers. And I was neither of those things. And so, yeah, so it's kind of like, what are we going to do? And that was kind of the overarching question of the year. But I really kind of thought of my role as, when you have 10 siblings, there's not a lot of one-on-one attention. You
Mm.
don't usually get the focus of an adult. And so that was something that was really special for me. So my year was kind of split into two. The first half of the year, I read, I did a lot of reading with the kids. A lot of these kids come to Kudavana not having good education before. Maybe they didn't go to school. They were in and out of school, so they're often really behind. And so with the first and second graders, I would every morning spend a half hour with each one, reading with them and to them. And so it was fun because they got me all to themselves. They got to work on their reading and they improved a lot. I played on the playground a lot with the kids. I would eat dinner in the homes. And so I'd eat dinner, I'd help them do the dishes and their evening chores. We'd do worship together. So I kind of just spent time with them. And then the second half of the year, because we got an addition of 2 new babies, really small, ill babies that needed a lot of attention, I started to spend most of my days in the nursery. So that's what I did the last few months.
Okay. And what did that look like as far as like what you would do, when you woke up to go to bed when you're working in the nursery?
So those days were super fun. I would get up as an SM around, so the way Wi-Fi worked is we basically didn't have very much Wi-Fi during the day, only in the middle of the night. So if we wanted Wi-Fi, we basically had to use it before 6 a.m. So I'd get up really early, contact my family, and then I'd go out and watch the sunrise. And then from there, I would eat breakfast and walk over to the nursery. That's about the time the babies would be waking up. And it's really fun because all our houses are in a circle. And so I could stand on my front porch and like watch the kids like open their windows when they wake up in the morning. And I can start to hear like the babies crying. And so I'll be like, okay, they're up, time for me to head over. And I would go over there and all their cribs in the back room are lined up in a row. And so they would all be in their cribs. And I would usually, the caregivers in the nursery would start one by one taking them to get them a bath, get them dressed. And so I would usually pick up one of the littlest. We had a newborn. And so I'd give him his bottle and just kind of like talk to the babies while they started to get their baths. And then I would help dress them and I would take them into the front room, feed them. And this whole thing, you're doing this for 10, 11 babies, right? So it takes quite a while to bathe them all, dress them all, feed them all. So then it's like an hour of just playing with them. And then it's their nap time. And so then I would go over to the school and that's when I would read and help with homework with some of the older kids. And then in the afternoon, we would take the babies from the nursery outside to the playground where the older kids were. All the kids would play outside. And then in the evenings, I would help give the babies dinner, put them to bed, and then head to one of the other homes to have dinner there.
Got you. That sounds like a packed day. And it's cool because you got to kind of experience, both like with the babies in the nursery, but also with like the older kids. So that's super cool because I know a lot of positions, especially like in the islands, if you're doing a teaching position, you only really have one set of people who you're catering to, whether that's high schoolers or that's elementary and middle school. But that's super cool that you're kind of able to do a little bit of everything. What would you say was the hardest thing about the work itself that you were doing over there?
I think one of the most challenging things for me, and I think the most surprising thing for me, it's so funny because they tell you like try not to go into your SM year with expectations, right? It's always different than you expect. And I was like, I have no expectations. I was wrong. I had one expectation. And my one expectation was that I would, how do I say this? I would connect with the kids, right? That I would just love these kids. And now hear me out because I did love these kids. But for years prior to SMing, I had babysat, nannied, coached gymnastics, worked at camp. Like I worked with kids. And so like I knew that I was good at it and that I loved the kids and they loved me. And when I got to Kudavana, I really struggled like building relationships with the kids. And it was just, it's hard to describe, but I really had a hard time almost like knowing how to interact with them. And I remember a few months in, like telling my mom, I was like, I felt more connected to like my campers after 1 week of camp than I do to these kids after
Mm.
months. And I think there are, especially upon reflection, a few reasons for that. I think one was kind of what you were saying. I was with newborn to 16-year-olds, which was, I loved it. I loved that I got to do a little of everything. But of course, you have to spend time with people to get to know them. So I really didn't have one landing base. I think cultural differences played a part. And especially with the little kids, this is just something interesting I noticed. But their culture, I think a lot of these kids are traumatized. Um, they don't play in the same way kids in America do. This is something I've learned working with children over the years, is play is a skill that children have to learn. Like you kind of teach kids how to throw a ball. Like that's what you do with a
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um and so a lot of kids in the US, like there's more imagination that happens, and that didn't happen as well. There's a lot more structured play. Like in Zimbabwe, these kids didn't really know how to do structured play as much. Um, and so it was just, I loved them. I do love them. But I interacted with them very differently than I did kids in the US. And I didn't expect that.
So how did you kind of bridge that gap? How did you connect with the kids that you could?
I think time. I think I started to recognize the difference, because at first I didn't really get it, because in the US I never had to work that hard to
Right.
like with kids. I coached gymnastics, and so I was always getting new students, and it was never something I had to think about. But I
Mm-hmm.
started, just as I spent time with kids, kind of realizing how they played, how they talked, how they communicated, and I was kind of able to match like my way of doing things to their way of doing things.
Yeah. No, I feel that. When I taught second grade, and I noticed after the first couple of weeks that I like wasn't connected at all to the high schoolers, and obviously it was because I wasn't like spending time with them, like you were saying. Like I would see them maybe a little bit after school, and I would like try to talk to them, but a lot of them thought I was like this scary, like intimidating person. And then like I was like, that's crazy because I'm out here like running around playing with like little second graders. Like I'm not that intimidating. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to, making time and effort for people, especially if you're in a different culture. Obviously, they're going to, view you as like an outsider, especially in, SM locations where the turnover rate for like SMs is every year they're having a new teacher like on the islands. That could get really hard, especially for the older kids, knowing that they're just going to leave. So making that time to make those connections is very like important to understand. But at the same time, to understand, you might have the expectation of going in and connecting with everyone, but you probably won't. Honestly, you know what I mean? Like you'll have like your group that you've impacted, but at the same time, there's a bunch of people that you probably haven't had a single conversation with. And that's just how it is because you're. I mean, it's a year. It sounds like a lot, but it's really limited, and your reach is limited. But that's something important to keep in mind while SMing. So now that we've talked about the hardest thing, what was your favorite thing to do while over there in your SM location?
I think the most special thing for me was the time that I got to spend in the nursery. And there are a couple reasons for that. So I kind of mentioned earlier the reason I started was because we got two babies. So how it works there is one day social services randomly will call and say, "Hey, we have a newborn and we have a 3-month old and his 5-year-old sister." And you go and pick them up. Except usually they tell you different ages and genders. So really you go and you never know who's going to be waiting.
Mm,
This day, I remember that because it was two infants, and infants take a lot more attention and they're a lot more expensive, because you have to buy formula, and in Zimbabwe, formula is not just expensive, it's almost impossible to find. And
mm,
so, in one way, on one hand, we were like, there's no way we can turn away these kids. But on the other hand, there was this practical side of we don't have the money or the space because our nursery was full and they happened to be short staffed at the time. So it was like, do we actually have the capacity to care for these babies? And so I'm overhearing this phone conversation and I hear that they need 10,000 or that it costs $10,000 to care for these. It would cost $10,000 to care for the 2 babies for a year. And I turned to the SM who was sitting next to me. And I don't know how I had this much confidence, but I was like, we can get to $10,000, right? And she was like, yeah, we can do that. And so we went and we said, if we can raise $10,000, can we take these babies?
Mm-hmm.
And by a total miracle, like I can't take credit for this, but we raised the $10,000 in 3 days.
Wow. Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah, so we ended up saying yes to the babies before we had the $10,000. Just, with faith, we're like, it'll come. Came faster than we expected. And one of these babies, it was a miracle that he was alive because we were told newborn. But here's the thing, he was actually born 3 months premature.
Mm.
And babies that are born 3 months premature usually have either do not survive or they have, severe challenges. They're in a NICU. This 3-month-old, when he came to us, so he was 3 months premature, 3 months when he came to us. And so he was 5 pounds. He was 2.5 pounds when he was born. And he was found in a field. So here's how we made this connection. On the birth certificate, if a baby is abandoned and taken to the hospital, the nurses will just make up a name. And so on his certificate, this baby had a last name, Banana. And we're like, Banana, that's really weird. And one of the caregivers in the nursery said, Banana, I know a story. And 3 months earlier, she had been listening to the radio and they told a story about a baby, a 2.5-pound baby found abandoned under a banana tree, and how found the baby, got him to the hospital. And this caregiver said, I prayed that baby would come to Kudavana, and now here he is.
Wow.
Yeah, so she had prayed for him. He was there. It was just a miracle he survived. It was a miracle that we had the money for it. And then there was the other baby, 3 to 5 months old. He was super sick. He actually got sent back to the hospital for a while because of dehydration and malnutrition. So they were just really sick, weak babies. And so I started helping in the nursery and taking care of them. And so I really bonded with them. And, babies can't talk. So you're just kind of like, when you're with them for 5 hours at a time, I don't know, you make a connection somehow. But I just got to watch them go from he was 3 or 5 months old. We don't really know. I kind of got to watch him go from really weak and lethargic, and he didn't really respond to like sounds or any stimuli. But I remember the first day walking in and I said, good morning, like I always do. And he turned and looked at me. And he'd never done that before. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first time I saw him grab onto a blanket because he didn't have grip strength before. And finally he was strong enough to hold on to something. And so I think just getting to see them, I really got to see the impact that Kudavana can have. And I got to get to know them. They kind of felt like mine because I spent so much time with them those first 2 months.
That's awesome. How did you guys raise the $10,000?
We just put out. So I remember as they were going to pick up the babies from the hospital, the other SM and I, she kind of knows how to do graphic design, and so she made something. We put it out on social media. I started writing emails to like the donor list. So this is part of the miraculous part of it. We contacted people that we knew that were not general donors to Kudavana. But as just donations started coming in, we had a spreadsheet and there were all these names that we'd never heard of before. And so we don't really know where the money came from. Like we put it on social media, we contacted people, but there are all these names where we have no idea the connection. We have no idea how they saw the post, but they did. And we're thankful.
That's super cool. That's awesome. This is kind of off topic, but what would you guys do just kind of like for recreation, for fun in your location? I know with all that work, I'm sure it would get tiring. You kind of want like a break from all of it. So what would you guys do to kind of like on your downtime if you guys had any like free days or stuff like that?
So surprisingly, we actually had quite a bit of free time because every afternoon after the kids like had their playtime, they would go home to take baths and do their chores. And us SMs, we were a distraction. So we stayed away. And so we had a couple hours every afternoon that was free. The thing about where we were, as opposed to like the islands, is there's nowhere to go. We're literally like rural, just there's nothing around.
Yeah.
We read a lot of books. We played a lot of card games. Something fun that we did with the kids was that we, thankfully, because it was so hot, we lived right by a reservoir. And so we would take the kids swimming sometimes. But our days were quite simple.
That's cool. No, that's awesome. I mean, I'm sure that made for even more, time with the kids and more connection with them and time to bond with them. And that's something, that I know in some locations, a lot of SMs wish there was more of that. And so that's great that you had the opportunity to do that. While you were there, did you receive any culture shock in your location? And if so, could you elaborate on it?
My first instinct is to say no. I mean, although there were very obvious like differences, I don't think it was shocking. I think we really benefited from the fact that, we were in a pretty isolated area, and the staff at Kudavana and the kids, they had met Americans. It's kind of partially run by Americans, and so they kind of knew how to help us out. I think it would have been very different if I had been in the city, because we would go to town once a week to do shopping, and that was overwhelming. But I think kind of just what I was saying about like with the kids, just things, the way you communicate is different. Their things are not said directly, so there were things where it's like if we asked a question to one of the staff, we knew that they weren't going to give us their honest answer because they didn't want to say anything that would like upset us. And so that made to kind of learn, because we wanted to know, hey, how do things work?
Right.
What's appropriate? Like, what are you comfortable with? And we realized pretty quick we weren't going to get honest answers. So there were definitely like obvious cultural differences, but I didn't feel that like overwhelming shock.
Yeah. No, I feel that. You said that you did feel it was kind of overwhelming when you would go into the city. How so? Like, would you talk a little bit about that?
You just feel really exposed. We drew a lot of attention. And so it's like we would go into town and we knew that all eyes were on us. A big reason is because US dollars there carry a lot of weight. And so the grocery store, what they basically have an online, because there's just not cash. Cash is not available. And so they use like their country's version of Cash App basically to pay for everything. And so often what people wanted to do was like pay for our groceries with their like money, and then we would give them cash, which we actually didn't pay with cash most of the time. But it was just like we were often getting stopped, asked to do that, and like you feel bad saying no, and it's just, I think that was like the hardest part. I didn't feel unsafe. I just you couldn't blend in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm sure like there's so many differences between what you guys look like and the local people. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you know, you definitely like stuck out. Um, how was it connecting with the kids as far as that aspect of like your cultural differences and you know, whether you think how should I put this? I mean, yeah, I guess that's my question. Yeah. How do you think that would compare between you and the kids? Like as far as do you think there was a cultural barrier, a language barrier, stuff like that?
So the language thing is actually really interesting because the kids speak Shona, which is the local language there. But from what I we picked up, we were never able to totally figure it out. Shona is one language, but it sounds like there's so many different like dialects of it and versions of it that unless they were lying to us, which there's always the chance, um, sometimes even the kids wouldn't understand each other.
Mm,
And so the kids, the idea is English is a official language of Zimbabwe. And so a lot of higher education in Zimbabwe is in English. And so it's important that the kids know both. So the kids would speak Shona at home and then they would speak English at school, which
mm,
also with culture shock, right? Is because I could communicate. But there's this interesting dynamic because some of the kids, depending on how long they'd been at Kudabana, like we had some new kids come in that didn't know English. They only spoke Shona. And some of the other kids said, I don't really know that much Shona anymore. I can't talk to them. Or like, I know a different sort of Shona. And then the English they used was interesting because one, Zimbabwe used to be a British colony. So they use a lot of British words. And they also phrase things very differently. And it's not like incorrect. It's not like grammatically incorrect and not, oh, just like second language, rephrase. It's like very
hmm
consistently the way people organize their sentences was different. And so at the beginning, this is something that just took time was I would say things and they didn't really understand what I was saying. But after I observed how they spoke, I could rephrase my sentences and all of a sudden they would understand.
Gotcha.
So it was just this interesting thing because they knew the words that I was saying, but it was like the concept didn't make sense. And so
Yeah.
there wasn't a language barrier, but in a way there was.
Yeah. Did you kind of keep that habit when you came back and was like kind of talking in that same way?
So the other SM and I, we wondered because we started, because some of it just sounds ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
some of the things, and also like there's a lot of noises that they make that have meanings.
Mm,
And so we just found that like even when it was just us two, we would talk like that, and we're like, oh my
yeah.
goodness, talking like kids. But it didn't last as much as I thought it would when I came home.
Yeah. I feel that. Did you receive any culture shock when you came home?
I think coming home, I had to come home early because of COVID. I think
Right.
coming home into lockdown, because that's when things were like really locked down, I think that
Mhm.
helped me a lot actually, because a lot of SMs, um, that I talked to before, they said when they came home, the hardest thing for them was how overwhelming big groups were and how
Mm,
overwhelming it was to have so many people asking them questions.
mm,
And I didn't experience either of those things. So
right.
I thought going into it I'd have like much more reverse culture shock. But I think being home made the adjustment easier because it happened a lot slower.
Yeah, I would agree. I when I came home, it was again like around the same time as where it was like lockdown for COVID, and that definitely I feel like played a role in almost like cushioning the reentry process almost.
Yeah.
Um, but what if you can think of one thing that you could take away from your SM experience that you've been able to bring back home and put into practice here that you're not any longer in the mission field, what would that be?
Something that I was continually reminded of when I was in Zimbabwe was A lot of times, like when people hear that I was a student missionary, that I lived in Zimbabwe, they're like, wow, that's so cool. That was amazing. Like, it sounds like this big dramatic thing. And in a way, it was. Like, I lived in the middle of nowhere on the other side of the
Mm-hmm.
world. That's a big thing. But my day to day life, I was constantly like reminded that it wasn't a whole, like, a day at Kudavana was not very different than a day here in the US babysitting or working at camp. Um, and I kind of had to learn, like, sometimes even during my SM year, I was like, I feel like I'm supposed to be doing something like more exciting than this, after I've been playing Uno for 4 hours and pushing kids on the swing for hours and, like holding the same baby for hours.
Right.
Like it just felt so repetitive. And so I think I just learned to kind of appreciate the little things and just recognize that like the way we spend our days is ultimately like that's what makes up our experience. People ask
Yeah.
me, like, what was it like? And they want to hear the cool, crazy stories. And there were a few of those. But ultimately, like my big, crazy stories were 4 of the 200 days I spent in Zimbabwe.
Right.
So I think just appreciating all the little things and doing the little things well is something that I learned there and try and do here too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great perspective to have, especially in our, when you're in school, I feel like every day can become like it almost just kind of melds into one just because it's so like routine like. And definitely having that type of mindset where there's always something in a day that you can appreciate, no matter how big or how small it is. And, at the end of the day, like you can do a lot of the stuff we were doing in our SM locations, you can do right here at home, whether that's babysitting or, teaching or going out and doing service projects. Every honestly, I think everything that we did out there, we could easily do here. And so, being able to recognize that you need to appreciate the small things in life, and just the day to day stuff, no matter how routine it might seem or it might get, just being able to take a step back and, have that perspective that you can always take something out of each day is super important. So that's awesome. Would you, if you were to be advising someone that was going to your location in Zimbabwe, what would you tell them?
To my specific location.
Yeah, to your specific location.
Hmm.
And it could be something that you wish you had known before going or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think I would say really appreciate the little things and the in between moments. I often felt like, man, I don't really have a job. Like, I'm not really doing anything. Like, I'm wasting my time. But I think some of the most special things about my time there, and I think the things that were the most beneficial for the kids were, when I would help the kids wash dishes after dinner. And like, that's when they would just ask me questions. That's when they got brave enough to ask me questions
Mhm.
that they've been thinking about. And, you know, I think just enjoy the little moments. You don't have to be doing something big and exciting every day because kids just want someone to play with. Kids just want to feel
Yeah.
loved. Um, and that's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the times where I connected with students the most was just again in like the small things, whether it was just hanging out with them after school while they're waiting for their parents to get picked up, or just going out and actually talking to them during recess instead of just running away to the student lounge or to the teacher's lounge and stuff like that. So I think that applies to a lot of different locations, and I think that even applies, here on campus. Just being able to recognize when you can take an opportunity to reach out to someone or even reach out to like your friends, like a lot of people you don't know what they're going through, and just being able to take the time to just communicate with them and just like hang out with them is super important. So I think that's a super cool takeaway. um, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I appreciate the time that you've spent with me on the podcast. Is there anything else that you would want to say to any person either thinking about it, thinking about going to Zimbabwe specifically, or just SMing in general. If you have any last words, you can go ahead and share those right now.
I think I would just want to reiterate kind of what I've been saying, and that is if you want to go as an SM, that is a wonderful thing to do. But when you're an SM, living life as an SM, the goal is to, serve God, to show other people God's love. And that's something that you can do wherever you are. And doing it as an SM is not going to look very different or any different at all than it does here. The difference is just how intentional you are about it. So
yeah,
SMing is great because it puts that intentionality kind of on the forefront. So it's a great way to learn it, but you can also do that here at home.
Yeah, I agree with that. SMing gives you more of an opportunity to do so, but at the same time, it really just comes down to who you are and how much intention you want to put out, as you were saying. So that's something for everyone to consider who's listening. If you're thinking about SMing, obviously SMing kind of has like this big like glorious thing behind it. You might go like do some crazy things, but at the end of the day, the mission is just how much you're willing to put into it and how much effort you want to be and how intentional you want to be. So thanks again for being on the Called podcast. Would you be okay if I have your information so people can ask you questions about Zimbabwe or ask you questions about SMing in general?
Yeah, I can give you my Instagram is my name, ANNALIESE.K. So you can DM me, email me. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Perfect. You heard it here. And again, the SM office is still taking applications. It is not too late, not even close. So if you are thinking about it, definitely go ahead and either talk to a past SM or walk into the office, and they will be more than happy to hook you guys up with some advice or just whatever you guys want to talk about. Anyone in there is more than happy to talk to you about SMing. With that, I'll go ahead and end this episode, and be sure to come back next week for another episode of the Called podcast. Thank you.